Hello there, everyone who's watching, and sorry about the short wait there. I messed up the invite at the start, but we're all sorted now. And I'm here with Duncan Pritchard, who's a philosopher, primarily focusing on epistemology. We've done an interview before on like an introduction to epistemology, and today we're going to be talking about religious epistemology, comparing Plantinga's project with Wittgenstein's project, which is something that you've published on quite a lot in this kind of area. You're in California right now still, is that right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Okay, just south of LA.
Awesome. So I'm guessing the weather's a bit better than it is here then.
Yeah, it's like that song La La Land, you know, it's another day of sun. That's the
right.
yet another day of sun. Yeah.
And another cloudy, horrible one here in Manchester. So
I don't miss the weather.
Yeah, probably even worse in Scotland. So when we're talking about religious epistemology then, to sort of just briefly introduce some of the topics and some of the main issues, I mean, what are the main concerns? We'll hear people talk about belief in things like gods or in religious experiences, words like faith. What are some of the main kind of important issues in religious epistemology?
Yeah, so in fact, all the issues you just mentioned are core issues. The rationality of religious belief. What is it to have religious belief? Actually, that's not obvious. It's not even obvious that it's a belief, actually, interestingly.
Right.
And related things like, you know, what counts as evidence? What's religious experience? And is there a way of thinking about religious experience such that it has some evidential bearing? Right. Some people think not, and some people think it does. You're in it's hard to defend the rationality of religious belief unless you can appeal to religious experience for obvious reasons. Then, like, you know, what's the evidential status of, you know, scripture or testimony, religious testimony? Religious traditions often put a big epistemic weight on testimony and on certain sources like scripture, which are different epistemically from our usual sources. You know, we don't normally defer to great books in our beliefs, but religion is one case where that happens. And there's also other issues which kind of run orthogonal to this. You know, like, for example, there's a big debate in philosophy of religion about how to understand the properties of God. What if there is a being like God, what kind of properties would he have? And some of the issues that arise there are epistemic. Right. So, like, what does it mean for God to be omniscient? Actually, that's actually a very puzzling notion. It seems like there are some things God can't know because of his nature. And there are some things he can't know because of his nature, because of other qualities he has. I mean, for example, some people think God, you know, if you think God is perfectly good, and if you think perfect goodness means he has to grant us freedom, then it seems his perfect goodness mitigates against his omniscience because he can't know that what we'll do next. So he has to somehow not know the future in order to give us free will. So there are really interesting questions there. And I think actually all these questions, I think, are whether you're religious or not. These are just really interesting questions. Right. So I always try and encourage people to think of it that way, right? Because often with an issue like this, you come at it with some personal conviction, one way or the other. But really, I just think of it as these are fun questions. You know, even if you don't believe this kind of thing, just understanding, you know, billions of people do, understanding the epistemic issues is kind of like a very useful test case for understanding epistemology in general, how it applies to a domain.
So how do we come at these issues, taking into account the kind of presuppositions, biases, the kind of intellectual framework, I suppose, that we're going to use to interpret any new information that comes at us? How do we sort of, I suppose, go at getting past some of that to make sure we're establishing true beliefs about this topic?
I don't think there's anything special that's problematic about this domain. I think that the kind of issues you just raised, they're issues for any domain. So, you know, you could ask the same question about scientific claims. You know, how do we get? Right. I mean, in fact, this is quite directly one of the big epistemic topics. You know, what is it to have access to the world? Our access to the world seems mediated in various ways. To what extent then is it reliable? A truth conducive access to the world? And so I think those issues are very general. Funnily enough, one of the big things I work on in epistemology is precisely those issues about skepticism, truth, relativism. But I think they're completely separate. So I don't think they're real issues, but they're not issues that have a particular purchase here. I think they're issues, whatever epistemic domain you're interested in, they crop up. I'm very happy to come back about those issues, by the way, if you want.
Yeah, it'd be. I mean, I think there's so much to cover and talk about. So I'll try and keep my questions then fairly focused. And if we have time, or maybe in future, we can come back and talk about some of those other broader concerns then. So one of the people who's gone about, I suppose, tackling this broader concern in epistemology, but particularly with a religious slant, is Alvin Plantinga, and he's got a kind of particular story to tell about our faculties, about like a particular conceptual analysis of what knowledge is. What is Alvin Plantinga's project? What's the story that he has to tell about beliefs, and how does that relate particularly to, I suppose, Christian religious beliefs?
Yeah, so the Plantinga's project has been hugely influential. It's very interesting. It's called Reformed Epistemology. The way to understand it, I think, is in contrast to evidentialism. So evidentialism is a view that's usually attributed to Locke, although actually various people, I think, could qualify as evidentialists. Locke had a very famous discussion of religious belief in his essay concerning human understanding. I'm trying to remember, I think it's book 19, if you want to look it up. Very interesting. Locke lived during a period of great religious tensions. I mean, previously, the Bible had become translated into English and become widely available. And you have this period where basically everyone's doing their own theology. And you have it's really a fascinating period, actually. Particularly, most of Europe, you have people on street corners, different sects emerging all the time, running battles between different groups and so on. Locke called these people as he called famously, the enthusiasts. How do we deal with these people? Because they were destabilizing society. And so what he wanted was a way of, he wasn't attacking religious belief. He was trying to have a way of differentiating sort of reasonable religious belief from the unreasonable kind, the kind the enthusiasts have, who keep causing the troublemakers and so on. And so he came up with various evidential standards. I mean, very roughly, the idea is you should proportion your belief to the evidence you have for it. So in a case like religion, where there's a lot of certainty and a lot of conviction going on, you need very high standards of evidence. And he put some quite strict constraints on the evidence that would be applicable. I mean, in particular, Locke was looking for a kind of evidence that was, in a sense, public and not private. So to move away from a conception of evidence where you just go on your own brute conviction or your brute personal experience, and you appeal to things that are publicly accessible, they're in the public realm, and all rational people can evaluate them. So very different to what the enthusiasts are up to. The enthusiasts have some deep truth that's available only to them, and then they communicate it to you, and you've got to decide whether to trust them. The idea is, no, that's not the way to do these things. We have like a religious tradition, and we appeal to that, and that's how we have rational religious beliefs. So Locke wasn't attacking religious belief. But one thing that interesting that happened was that the evidentialist standard for religious belief sort of turned back on itself. I mean, it's just a bit like Descartes, actually. Descartes had this skeptical view, and then he responds to the skeptical view. No one really remembers Descartes' response, beyond philosophers anyway. Everyone remembers the skepticism, right? Because that's the thing that survived. It's the same with the evidentialism. Locke has a kind of skeptical argument. It's not meant to be against religious belief in general, but over time people start to apply that standard to all religious belief, and they say, well, actually, in what sense does religious belief really have the kind of, does it meet these evidential standards? I mean, for example, a lot of people at the time when Locke was writing thought that there were a priori considerations in favor of God's existence, but nobody really thinks that now, or they may be doing it in some modified, very weak way.
Yeah.
So there, I mean, if that worked, if there wasn't like an a priori argument for God's existence, then that would be excellent evidence that everyone can accept as good evidence. But if you don't think there's anything like that, then in what sense are there publicly kinds of evidence? I mean, you can appeal to tradition and scripture and so on. These are public, but they also seem, in a sense, kind of in a secular society, somewhat tendentious, right? Because lots of people don't accept that these things tell us anything, right?
Right.
So the evidentialist standard over time became one that actually undermined confidence in the rationality of religious belief. And what Plantinga was trying to do is to revisit that evidentialist standard, him and other reformed epistemologists like William Alston and Nicholas Wolterstorff, and try to show how this is actually illegitimate. And the basic line is this: it's what's called a parity argument. The thought is, whatever epistemic standards we apply to religious belief, they ought to be standards that we would apply to any kind of belief. They ought not to be special to religious case. And he thinks that we are applying much higher standards to religious belief than we apply to ordinary belief. And what kinds of belief he focuses on are cases like perceptual belief. We all think, radical skeptics aside, we all think perceptual belief is a route to knowledge. It's not meant to be contentious in any way. But as he points out, perceptual belief doesn't meet the evidentialist standard either. We don't have any non-circular way of justifying the reliability of our perceptual beliefs. I mean, think about it. How do we find out your perceptual beliefs are reliable? It's by using more perceptual beliefs. We don't have any, in general, we have no non-circular justification for perception. We have a kind of basic belief that we have these basic beliefs that we get through perception as they're known. They're not justified by anything else, but they seem to be perfectly in order. And the usual story as to why they're perfectly in order epistemically is what's called a faculty story. So we tell a story, broadly reliable a story. So you say, we have certain perceptual faculties, they're reliable, they've evolved over time to be adaptive to the circumstances. And if they're functioning appropriately in the right kind of conditions, then you can get knowledge through perception. You don't need to have independent reasons to trust in perception. Like if you're in the right kind of conditions, you just open your eyes and you get lots of perceptual knowledge. And Plantinga says, well, this is what's known as an externalist story about reasons and evidence, because it's a story that appeals to features of the environment, you and your relationship to the environment. And it doesn't appeal to reasons or anything. And Plantinga says, well, that story ought to be available. If it's available in the perceptual case, it ought to be available in the religious case. And so it's a very clever move. He says, well, look, he appeals to a certain Calvinist tradition, this is why it's called Reformed Epistemology, because the terminology comes from that Calvinist tradition, which has this idea of the sensitive initatis. You find this in lots of different traditions, actually, but it's very at the fore in the Calvinist tradition. The idea that we have a basic religious faculty. We're kind of born with a God-given faculty to have beliefs about God. And as long as things are working fine and everything, then that faculty will function reliably and give us those beliefs reliably. Now, of course, it can be impaired in various ways. The Calvinist story says that it can be impaired through sin and so forth. And it can be strengthened in ways too. Just like the perceptual case, you can impair that and strengthen it. And so Plantinga appeals to that story. He says, well, why should I have to appeal to this very austere conception of evidence, of reasons that the Lockean tradition gives us in order to justify rationality of religious belief? It ought to be enough to appeal to just what I appeal to in the perceptual case, to say, well, there can be basic religious beliefs too. They're basic in the sense they're not supported by reasons or anything. They amount to knowledge because they're formed in the right kind of way through a faculty. And of course, Plantinga recognizes, well, lots of people don't believe such a faculty exists. He says, well, it's your loss, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with the story on that score. I mean, he'll say, look, I've got a story. It's a story about the rationality of religious belief. It's a story structurally exactly the same as a story we tell about other kinds of belief, like perceptual belief. So you can't object to it on that point. You can object to the facts of it. You can say, well, I don't agree there is such a faculty. Well, but then everything just reduces to the fact, well, you're an atheist and I'm a believer. That doesn't add anything. I have a story to tell about why my belief system is such that it could result in knowledge. And you don't have a story to tell about why this belief system wouldn't result in knowledge. You just simply have the bare assertion that you're an atheist and you don't believe in these kind of faculties. So the whole thing kind of collapses into just debate, well, do you believe that there's a God and so on, or don't you? Right? But we knew that already, right? The issue that we're trying to deal with, this wasn't that issue. It was a more general issue. Even if there is a God, and even if you're appropriate to him, it seemed like you couldn't know anything about him. You couldn't know anything. You couldn't have your religious beliefs could never amount to knowledge. And Plantinga says that's just not true. It really depends upon whether these basic conditions are met. If they are, then you can know lots of things. You can know God exists and so forth. There's no deep problem about the rationality of religious belief.
So I suppose. Sorry, my apologies. You.
I didn't know.
Okay, I suppose from Plantinga's point of view, that's providing a sort of story for the theist. But let's suppose someone. Well, presumably Plantinga didn't always have this story. He came to it at some point. About the way that our I forget the necessary and sufficient conditions he gives, cognitive faculties that are aimed at truth in an environment that they're supposed to work in, and something else. I always forget the exact way it's phrased, maybe.
Yeah, it's called a proper functionalist view. So
right.
Your faculties are properly functioning in an environment to which they're suited. That's the basic idea.
But suppose... sorry, I keep it. I think there's a bit of a delay, so I keep...
I've got to stop. I've got to stop and then stop and not say anything else. That's because the delay. Sorry.
It's okay. So I suppose if we're not already convinced of this, it's going to sort of sound rather ad hoc, kind of like, you know, a lot of evolutionary stories will sound kind of like just so stories. You know, the reason why there's more men in Wall Street is because in our hunter-gatherer days, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
And I suppose it can sound to the outsider something like a theological version of that. Now, is it supposed to be convincing for the person who's not already a theist, or is it that not the job it's meant to be doing, really?
So Plantinga, the project, I mean, it's really quite astonishing what he did. There are 3 books. It's a trilogy. The first book, it's called War and the Current Debate. The first 2 came out in 93. The third one came out about 2000. The first book isn't about religion at all. It's simply, he surveys all the key views about knowledge in literature. And he just argues, he goes through them all, and he just says, look, what's the most plausible view? Yeah, excellent. Yeah. What's the most plausible view it says about the nature of knowledge? And he comes up with this proper functionalist view, and it's a very influential view. And it's not like it's a view out of nowhere. It takes elements from different views, from reliabilist traditions and certain responsibilist traditions and so on. Virtue epistemology looms large there, and so it's in the vicinity of a ballpark of lots of other views. It's not an off the wall view. It's a pretty mainstream view, and he makes a very persuasive defense of it and so on. And then in the second book, he starts to apply it to the religious case. And in fact, the next 2 books really are about applying it to the religious case. So, and I think that's a really interesting way of going about it. It's like independently defend the view, so completely independently of any religious application, and actually do a full book-length defense of it, and then apply it to the religious case. And I think that's part of why it's been so influential, is that it doesn't come out of nowhere. I mean, as he says, you know, you can reject the religious stuff, but you should still accept the view, right? And the view is quite plausible, right, as a general view. Yeah. And in fact, lots of people do. I mean, there are lots of people who accept that kind of, broadly speaking, proper functionalist view about warrant. But they don't follow him on the religious application. Yeah. Because they don't think there's such a thing as sensus divinitatis, etc. But still, the normative view about what knowledge is accepted. Yeah. So that underlines a lot of the worries about it being ad hoc.
I suppose in the case of if I was kind of postulating something about why memory might be reliable, or how memories are formed, and I was talking about the hippocampus, I'd be making a kind of empirical claim about the way that brains work. And is there anything that, you know, like should it be a concern for the kind of Plantingan to sort of have some area of the brain that they can point to and say that this is the Aquinas Calvin unit or whatever, or what? Like, why do they not have to do that? I suppose for the person who's not so involved in epistemology, and they're kind of coming to this, and they're hearing theists say, you know, I'm a reformed epistemologist, so it can sound to them rather unconvincing. I mean, maybe it works for you, kind of thing, but what's that supposed to do for me? Why should I buy this?
Okay, good. Two things. The first one, just about proper functionalism. It doesn't. You can be proper functionalist and not think it applies to the religious faculty, because it's just a general case about what would it be for knowledge to result from your faculties, basically. And then it's an open question. What are you? It's kind of a scientific question there, broadly scientific question. What faculties do you in fact have, and which ones meet these conditions? Now, of course, as you say, Plantinga, of course, is postulating a faculty which is probably not going to be scientific. I actually don't know now I think about it. What he says about this, I assume he just says it's not scientifically inspectable. It's not that kind of faculty. Now we get to the second question, right? Well, is that a problem? And I think he's going to say, look, there are 2 kinds of stories you can tell. The original objection to religious epistemology was that the religious epistemologists had no coherent story at all to tell. Even by their own lights, they had no story. Right. I mean, this was the evidentialist worry, that you take lock standards, you apply them consistently, then any kind of religious belief doesn't meet those standards. So by its own lights, it's a problem. What Plantinga is doing is saying, well, look, no, I have a story to tell which by my lights is perfectly good. And you should recognize as well that by my lights is a perfectly good story, because the kind of story it is a story that you tell as regards other domains. Right. So there's nothing special about the story. Now, of course, you might say, but it's not a story that would convince me. But Plantinga is going to say, well, yeah, I wasn't perfect set. I'll give you that, right? I mean, there's kind of like a strong and a weak sense of rationality. I think sometimes we slip between them. Like a strong sense of rationality, I give reasons reasons should convince everybody. It's hardly ever the case. There's reasons like that. I mean, the weak sense, the more general sense of reasons is I've got good reasons, and I can, for my belief. And Plantinga said, well, I've got that. I've just told you a story. And reasons, when you can see that they're good reasons as well, even if you don't accept them, you can see that from your perspective, from the alternative perspective, they're reasons that fit together in an appropriate way. So I think that's the way to do it. It's kind of like a levels thing. He's not saying he's got reasons that would make an atheist become a believer or anything like that. Of course, and there's all sorts of. I mean, depends. I mean, I guess if you're, well,
if it's true, then it is the thing that would convince her. Yeah.
Well, but this is that's what I was trying not to get into. This kind of there are some Calvinistic. I mean, suppose you get in the Calvinistic route, then there are very good reasons why the other person is not going to accept it, because their faculty has been affected by sin. Of course, the other view some people who subscribe to sense divinitatis have is that there aren't really any atheists. This is the old "there's no atheist in a foxhole." You know that expression?
Yeah,
people say they're atheists, but it's kind of like they're kind of self-deceiving. That deep down they really do believe, and so on. I mean, that would be another expression of a sense divinitatis kind of view. So where the faculty go, it's not the faculty going amiss. It's kind of like your higher order faculties they've gone wrong in not accepting this kind of brute deliverance of the faculty.
Right. Yeah, I have had a lot of conversations with presuppositionalists in the Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bonson tradition, but they tend not to paint as sophisticated as a position as just sort of read Romans 1:20 at you and kind of tell you. But this isn't a position that you wholly accept, because you go for, I think, is it a quasi-fideism? Is that the approach that you take? And this is based off of so if we sort of go into comparing and contrasting then this Plantingan story against like a Wittgensteinian story, how would that kind of look if we began to go down that route?
Yeah, so they're very different. So independently, I defend a view which is comes from the very late of Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein's very final notebooks. There are 4 notebooks. They take us until just a few days before he dies. Really interesting historical documents. He never edited them. They're just impressionistic remarks, never intended for publication by him. And they're just interesting historical documents anyway. And there's wonderful there's moments where he says things like, I can't get to the beginning of things. I guess I never will now. So you're really getting this snapshot of someone in the final days of their life struggling with these questions about knowledge, certainty, and so forth. They were published as On Certainty after his death, edited by Anscombe von Richt. The standard line is that they're responses to G. Moore. G. Moore had this line about this common sense line that you can know you have these basic certainties, these everyday certainties like I've got hands, and these can be a kind of foundation against which you can push back against a skeptic. And Wittgenstein definitely is targeting those claims. Through Malcolm, he'd stayed with Norman Malcolm in Ithaca just before, and Malcolm had been writing on Moore, so that's kind of, there's been a connection there. There isn't that much mention of the religious case in these notebooks, but I think actually it's in the background. So here's the sort of view, the interesting view in uncertainty that comes out, which I think is really fascinating. It's this idea that it's part of the very structure of reasons, of rational evaluation, that there has to be there's a certain kind of basic certainty which must be in place in order for that even to make sense. So the idea of there being a rational evaluation independently of you having some basic convictions is just incoherent. And that's what he's trying to convince us of in uncertainty. So these basic convictions are the hinges. It's called hinge commitments. And they're manifest. It's kind of misleading, I think, that, because actually it's like an overarching certainty that has to be in place, which is manifest in a commitment to particular claims, like I've got 2 hands, or I've never been to the moon, or my name is Duncan Pritchard, and so on. There are certain kinds of things, and we have this brute, visceral certainty in them. And he thinks that this isn't an accident. That brute, visceral certainty has to be in place in order for us to even make sense of reason and rationality. So we have this kind of Enlightenment picture of rationality, whereby we can rationally evaluate all of our beliefs at once. We can be like, we can get rid of all of our assumptions and so on, and everything is up for grabs in terms of rational evaluation. I mean, this you get this in Descartes. Remember in the Meditations, he thinks of beliefs as like apples. And he says that you don't inspect them one by one, just throw them all out. Right? It's a very evocative image. What Wittgenstein's saying is that image, although it's had a powerful hold over the modern mind, he thinks it's completely wrong. It's simply not possible. And uncertainty, I think, makes a really persuasive case for this. That there has to be this basic certainty in play in order for us to even make sense of reasons. And that basic certainty, because it has to be in place in order for us to make sense of rational practice, it cannot be itself rational or irrational. It is the framework. It supplies the framework against which rationality and irrationality make sense. And so it cannot be itself assessed for irrationality. So it's neither rational nor irrational. It's irrational. It's the bedrock against which rationality occurs. Now, I think this. So, and if this is right, it changes everything. By the way, this idea isn't in the Investigations or in other work. It really is a new idea to uncertainty. So, right at the end of Wittgenstein's life, I think he's got this new idea. Now I think that idea.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. I just wanted to ask how is that similar in any way to like a Kantian kind of transcendental argument? You know, like these categories that need to be presupposed in order to be able to think about things, which are obviously, you know, the categories Kant gives are empirically sort of false now. But how is it different from that? What Wittgenstein's saying?
Here's a key difference. There's a number of differences, but here's the key one, which I think is most important for our purposes. Transcendental arguments are meant to give you a rational basis for the transcendental element. So you find out that there are certain presuppositions of experience, and in discovering that they're necessary presuppositions of experience, you thereby have a rational basis for them. That's what a transcendental argument does. It gives you a kind of rational base. In fact, in the Kantian sense, it gives you an a priori basis for essentially empirical claims, that's what's so interesting about it. Wittgenstein isn't doing that at all. He's not saying if you follow this through, you can't do that with the hinges, because that would be to say, so therefore the hinges have some rational basis then, because they're necessary conditions for rationality. And Wittgenstein's saying no, they don't. They don't. You haven't. If you think that, you haven't understood it. I mean, this is why there's a really famous remark. I think it's key to uncertainty. He says at one point, the difficulty is to realize the groundlessness of our believing. And notice what he's saying, that it's not that the difficulty doesn't relate to the groundlessness of our believing. That's just a fact. The difficulty relates to our realizing it. You know, we seem to be sort of set up so we can't accept that fact. I mean, that's and he wants to say, no, this is how we are. Right. There is nothing, as it were, holding the whole thing together. There are these practices. The certainty has to be in place in order for the practice to make sense. Everything is internal to those practices. So that's why it's very different to a transcendental thing. Transcendentalism is still a rational story. Wittgenstein, I think, is trying to show the limits of such a rationalist. Rational evaluations have limits, and we can't go beyond them. And so what Wittgenstein, I think, is struggling with in uncertainty is two issues. One is relativism. Why doesn't this become relativism? And I think he has some things to say about that. And the other is, why doesn't it collapse into a kind of skepticism? Because it does look a bit like skepticism. You know, I think this is why it's so difficult to realize it, because he thinks that it on the face of it looks like it's a skepticism in disguise. But what he tries to convince us of in uncertainty, I think, is that actually it's the antidote to skepticism. Perversely, skepticism, he thinks that the skeptical drive, it predicates on this faulty view of reasons. And that once we get rid of that faulty view of reasons as being the kind of things that can be universal, he says, once we've got rid of that, I think we have a way out of the skeptical problem. The skeptical problem arises because of a weird kind of reification of our rational practices, which isn't, as he points out, it's not grounded in our ordinary practices at all. There's nothing in our ordinary practices that licenses this. It's a philosophical fiction, he says. So that's what he's doing in uncertainty. And I find this really compelling. I should say to your listeners, it's a very controversial view for obvious reasons. But I find it very compelling. And one thing I've tried to do in my work is that there's lots of people talk about hinge commitments, but they try and domesticate them. So they try and say, well, yeah, there's this view, but we can kind of, we can embed it in like a kind of transcendental view, and then we really do have reasons for the hinges. And lots of views of that kind. We really do know the hinges, we just don't know them in the usual kind of way or something like that. And what I've been trying to do with my work is actually to take Wittgenstein at face value and try and make sense of, well, what would it mean to to actually embrace that and say that our most basic certainties are not known. We have no rational basis for them at all. The things that which we're most convinced are such that there's no rational basis for them. And how do we make sense of the idea that that could be an antidote to skepticism? So that's the sort of general project. But one thing that interests me is how that project relates to the religious case. And here's why this is important. I think the stimulus for Wittgenstein's work, and again, this is a controversial claim, but I think the stimulus comes from John Henry Newman, not really from More. More is kind of a conduit because he's talking to Malcolm and so on, and More is someone everyone's talking about at the time. But Wittgenstein had clearly read Newman's work. Newman was writing the sort of mid-19th century. If you don't know Newman, he's a very important religious figure. He's now a saint, actually, cardinal in his day, and then he's been canonized since. So he's gradually, ascended into the heavens.
An Anglican as well.
Well, he starts off Anglican, and ends up Catholic. I mean, he's the big apostate. So hugely controversial figure of his time because he's an apostate. And the kind of person who everyone would have read back then. We don't really read him now. People in divinity read him. Actually, analytical philosophers should read him, I think. The work is really good, very interesting. He has his key work is an essay native of ground of assent, which is full of interesting ideas. And he's basically a response to a kind of Lockean evidentialism and also Humean conceptions of reasons and evidence as well, like Hume on miracles and so on. And he offers this alternative view. The alternative view is very close to Wittgenstein's view, it seems to me, except that Newman isn't making a claim about reasons in general. He's just making a claim about reasons in the religious case. I mean, basically what Newman's doing is kind of like a parity argument. If you go think of what I said about Reformed epistemology, he's saying, look, evidentialists have a go at religious belief because it lacks this special kind of evidence. He says, but look at belief in general. Belief in general doesn't have this special kind of evidence. Most of our most basic convictions, he thinks, are essentially irrational. They're not grounded in reasons and evidence at all. And yet we think that there's, in the everyday case, we do know lots of things, and that can be perfectly rational. So if you go back to the religious case, then it seems you can't say there's anything wrong with religious belief because at its root, it has these irrational commitments. Because all belief at its root has these irrational commitments. And that, I think, that's basically what I call quasi-fideism. I mean, that's kind of like the Wittgensteinian idea as applied to religion. I mean, with Wittgenstein, we're going the opposite direction. We're taking a religious idea and generalizing it. But I think, with quasi-fideism, we're going back the other way. We're taking the general idea and applying it to the religious case. And it's fideistic because what it has in common with traditional forms of fideism is it says that a religious conviction at its root is basically irrational, not irrational or rational, but irrational. And that's a standard fideistic move. But it's very different from normal fideism. Normal fideism is kind of like a sort of ghettoization of religious belief. Belief in general is assessed in this way, and then there's this particular kind of belief over here, and we assess it completely differently. And in fact, actually, that's the view that's usually credited to Wittgenstein because he has earlier writings that seem to suggest it. But I'm suggesting that when he comes to his later works, he changes, and he goes quasi-fideist. Now the idea is, well, yeah, religious belief is essentially irrational, but all belief is essentially irrational. So there's no ghettoization. It's not that religious belief is to be evaluated differently from ordinary belief. It's in a way, it's kind of like a way, religious belief is exactly like ordinary belief. And we sort of, we kid ourselves if we think that it's any different. All that's different is, the religious belief and the non-religious belief have different hinge commitments, that's all. And so that's quasi-fideism.
Okay. So I think maybe at that point, it would be good to clarify some things because I think it, like when we're talking about these hinge commitments and where the religious, I suppose in like the model of what's going on here, where the religious beliefs fit in, the idea, I mean, one potential idea could be that the religious commitments are these hinge ideas, but these hinge beliefs, but or commitments, maybe that's the right way of wording it. But another way of going could be that we sort of all have the same hinge commitments, and then there's different intellectual structures, I suppose, that we could build up from there. And one of those is a religious story, and another one sort of isn't. I mean, do they have to be in tension? Is there one way that you're particularly going down here as opposed to the other?
So the way I think of it, and I think this is actually faithful to what Wittgenstein had in mind, everybody has the same basic hinge commitment. So an overarching hinge commitment is just a certainty that you're not radically in error. And I think that's what he thinks has to be in play. It's this basic, so that certainty has to be there before you can even get into the game of reasons. But then the interesting thought is, well, how does that certainty manifest itself? And he thinks it manifests itself the things that are most everyday for that person, things that are most mundane. And this is quite interesting because we think of them, the mundane isn't usually thought of as being philosophically significant, but on this view, it is very significant. And that's why we don't normally even notice our hinge commitments, because they're kind of hidden in plain view. They're so obvious that we don't even think about them. So, a claim like I've got two hands, it looks like a normal claim. It looks like it's rationally grounded in the usual. I mean, isn't it grounded in my seeing my hands? Wittgenstein says, well, if you think about it, that makes no sense at all. I mean, imagine you don't see your hands when and then you say, oh, someone says, do you have two hands? Go, oh yeah, there they are. Oh, I'm not sure. Oh yes, I do. I mean, this makes, someone says, where are your keys? Have you got your keys on you? And then I can go pat my pocket and go, oh yes, I do. That makes sense. The hands, as he points out, my having hands is how I evaluate other things. If my hands aren't there when I look for them, then this is now a reason to think there's something else wrong. It's not the reason. But primarily, I don't think I don't have hands. What I think is my eyesight's, did someone slip something in my drink or something? Yeah. So they play a different kind of role. Now, what they're doing is he thinks that we have this picture that comes with that certainty. And these commitments are they're like sort of nodes of that picture. They're sort of manifestations of that picture. And then the idea is that if you're religious, then a commitment to God's existence or something like, I mean, maybe that's a bit too abstract. Maybe it's like a commitment to, purpose in the world or the existence of miracles or something like that. There's certain kinds of commitments that would manifest that basic certainty. So when Wittgenstein says that the religious person sees the world differently, in a real sense, that's right, because they're structuring, from a rational point of view, they're structuring the world differently because they have a certainty which is different to someone who doesn't have those commitments. So there's an overarching certainty that everyone has, but how that manifests itself differs from person to person.
So this is interesting for me, because I'm also interested in Don Cupid's kind of theological work, where he draws on the sort of, I suppose, late Wittgenstein's philosophy of language to kind of, I mean, obviously that it is a completely different story to the one I suppose you're telling, where Cupid's taking this non-realist kind of approach. But I think a big motivating feature for him is Wittgenstein sort of saying that, well, what God is its use in language. It's not it's not this metaphysical entity out there. It's sort of what people mean by the way they act. And he has various quotes from Wittgenstein, like the tightrope walker. An honest religious thinker is hard to find, but it's kind of like walking on a tightrope. And but the man suspended by faith, you can see it from the inside or something. Or Christianity isn't a thing in history. It's something that happens internally in the believer's life. Some various quotes to that effect. Is that the view of Cupid's taking? That's like a different interpretation than to you, or is this like a different Wittgenstein again to what's in the investigations? Are they compatible in any sense?
So there's a shared core. The shared core is this idea of behavior manifesting one's certainty. So, for example, a philosopher might say, I doubt that I've got hands. As Wittgenstein points out, this is kind of like a fiction. Look at how they behave. They don't doubt they've got hands. I mean, it cannot. I mean, so one thing we have to divest ourselves of is we have the way we use language makes us think that we can, for example, doubt things or evaluate things and so on. And then he says, look at the behavior, look at the actions, look at how one acts. One can see there is no doubt there. There is nothing but certainty. And I think this is what Don Cupid is getting at in the religious case. So what is it? The religious believer and the non-religious believer, they may, you can have a religious believer racked with doubts. You can have a non-religious believer who pays lip service. But whether they really do believe will be manifest not in what they say, but in how they act. And there'll be certain kinds of practices, and there'll be manifestations of these certainties. So that's where I think the view is, that's one thread in Wittgenstein's later thoughts. Don't look so much at what people say, look at how they act. Then that gives you what's really going on. Particularly because to look at what people say, I think, is prone to the sort of philosophical fictions that lead us into problems. Where we diverge, I think, is the lack of the realism. The Wittgensteinian view and like the Newman view is a way of making sense of that realism. You know,
Right.
there really is the metaphysical God, and you're in contact with it. I mean, I think it kind of, in a sense, it makes that realism a bit more manageable. I mean, I think of Wittgenstein as being part of a tradition sometimes called skeptical fideism, which you get right the way. I mean, in the early modern period, big exponent of this is Montaigne, I think. Some people even think Hume falls in there. I mean, Hume just had these odd remarks where he talks about the true religion and so on, you know, as if he has some kind of basic religious belief that still survives all these skeptical thoughts. But Montaigne is very clear. I mean, the thought, and he goes through the ancient medieval period too, that there are very much limitations on what reason can give you, and so there's that's the skepticism moving through, and that means that and you find this again existentialist thought in Kierkegaard or whatever. What has to live on then is what's left is the faith, and you kind of in a sense you discover that by going through the rational process of evaluating beliefs, you discover that there are certain things that they're not responsive to these kind of considerations, and that's how you discover what really is the basis of your conviction. And these people are, religious people go through that process to discover what's really going on there. But we could do it. Anyone can do that. It's kind of like a Pyrrhonian process of inspecting your beliefs as much as you can, and then discovering, as the Pyrrhonians do, some things are not up for doubt. They're the kind of the hard features of us and our lives. That it's there like our life, as Wittgenstein says. They're not in the domain of rational evaluation now. And so that's kind of like a discovery, but it's sort of a skeptical discovery. We discover it by doubting. We discover the limits of doubt. By rationally evaluating, we discover the limits of reason. And I think that you can have that view without having separately from religious conviction, but it fits in quite nicely with a certain view about religious conviction. Reason goes so far, but it doesn't go all the way. And what's left behind can be these commitments of faith. But they're realist commitments, right? But they're realist commitments that are kind of moderated by the fact that you're not claiming any special epistemic access to this metaphysical entity. God on this view may be, wholly mysterious.
So I suppose one question sort of remains for me, at least, with this view, which is that it seems that people can question their religious beliefs. And then, at a later point in time, they'll be saying, well, I'm no longer convinced of, or I actually just don't think it's strict. Take, I don't know, David Friedrich Strauss as an example of something, someone who at one point in time would be committed to a kind of Orthodox Christianity. And then at a later point in time would be saying, well, he's submitting an essay on the resurrection that he's complete, that was the kind of last straw. He's no longer convinced of it happening at all. So does this view just kind of reject that what he's describing there is actually going on? Is his belief in God that he would have previously described still embodied in his actions or commitments? I mean, what does it kind of, what does it mean for the person who's able to kind of was it just not a hinge commitment that they had?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think it's a really key one for any proponent of this view to make sense of. I think what's key to it is understanding how, ignore the religious case for a moment, just think about our ordinary hinges.
Okay.
How do they change? Because they do change, right? I mean, people lose their hands, right? And they're no longer hinge committed to having hands. So what happened there, right? I mean, here's another case I think might be more useful rather than the hands case is one of the most famous examples is I've never been to the moon. Clearly a hinge commitment for him. No one had been to the moon. People have now been to the moon since. There may come a time in the future then whether or not you've been to the moon is a bit like asking me, an Englishman whether or not I've been to Norwich. I'm pretty sure I haven't, but I'm not hinge committed to it. It's
right.
Kind of I could have gone to and not been aware of. So at some point over time, it will cease to be a hinge commitment. Whether or not you've been to the moon, it might be the kind of thing you think you're not been to the moon, but it's not a hinge commitment. It's not going to rock your world if it turns out you've been to the moon. What's happening there? I have a story to tell about this. I think that you've got this base overarching hinge commitment, this certainty that you're not radically in error. You also have a set of beliefs, ordinary beliefs. They're not hinges. They respond to reasons in the usual kind of way. And which particular hinge commitments you have is kind of a function of that overarching certainty in your set of beliefs. So that's why, when Moore was writing as he did, he's got this basic certainty in play. He's got a certain set of beliefs that manifests itself in a conviction he's never been to the moon. someone 100 years from now, they've got that same overarching certainty. They have a different set of beliefs, right? Because they've lived in different conditions. It's not going to manifest itself in that hinge commitment. And that if you imagine someone who lives long enough, they live long enough so their set of beliefs changes over time, such that what manifests, which specific hinge commitments get manifest, that can change. Right. And I think it tells us something really interesting about hinges change. They change, but they don't change in the usual way. You change someone's beliefs through reasons and evidence and so on. If you want to change someone's hinge commitments, you can't, as it were, do it directly, because that commitment isn't going to be responsive to reasons. But what you can change is their beliefs. So think about, cases of religious disagreement. The creationists over here think the world was 3,000 years old or whatever, and people over here think it's billions of years old or whatever. So you've got this substantive debate. One way of going at it is, people just go head on. I think that's usually how they go, and we know it's useless, completely useless. I mean, think about
it's a great way to get people to double down.
Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly what happened. I think that there was this kind of died a death now. There's this new atheism movement where basically you had Dawkins and Hitchens and people like basically just yelling at religious believers, and it was completely useless at changing anyone's mind. And on the hinge view, this is to be expected. That's not going to change anything. But there are ways of changing people's minds. And what you have to do is change their broader set of beliefs. I mean, I think this is why if you want to change someone's mind, you've got to get to know them. I think getting to know someone, spending time with them, talking to them, over time you can change. If you can change enough of their broader beliefs. So, for example, if you can change their beliefs about how credible you are, through personal interactions, even though you don't believe certain things they do, that gives credibility to what you say. And so, over time, you can gradually change their beliefs. If you can do enough of that, you can change their hinge commitments. So, and I think this is kind of, deep disagreements, which I take to be disagreements about one's hinges. That's why they're so hard to resolve. Because the kind of commitments in play aren't normal beliefs. And that's why change is going to be, by its nature, I think, will tend to be gradual. And of course, you can have some unusual cases, like sort of tipping point type cases. I think some kinds of religious cases are a bit like that, where people their beliefs are sort of sliding towards a certain different view, and then something comes along which tips them over the edge. And then so the phenomenology from the inside, as it were, is like kind of everything changing at once. But I think if you look more closely at what's going on there, it's going to be like a sort of gradual, more receptiveness to that, and then boom, a tipping point kind of view. So I think that this actually strikes me as a sort of very realistic way of thinking about what deep disagreements are like and why they're so difficult to resolve. They can be, they're not in principle unresolvable, but they're very hard to resolve because of the kind of commitments that are in play.
So I certainly have more questions, but I tried to kind of distill out the core of what there was to get at. So hopefully we'll be able to finish on time, which is about now. But thank you for coming on. And I think, have you given up your lunch to do this interview?
Yeah, but that's fine. I could do with skipping a few lunches. I think the pandemic has had its effect on my waistline. So
me too. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I hope everyone's enjoyed listening in. Is there anywhere where people can either get in touch with you or that you'd want to kind of promote for people to read that you've got out there if they're interested in hearing more about this?
I mean, if you want to contact me, my email address is dhbritch@uci.edu. But just look at my name, UC Irvine, this there. And in fact, on my webpage, I've got various things you might find. I have a paper which I can alert you to, but it's on my webpage called A Faith and Reason, which I wrote for philosophy a few years ago, which is kind of like a summary of these sorts of views. So that way, and you might also be, I mean, my last book was on epistemic angst. It's a bit involved. It's a Princeton University Press, 2015. But that was basically talking about the Wittgensteinian view and not applying it to the religious case, but just in general, this idea of hinge commitments and trying to explain how it can be the antidote to skepticism. And so I'm quite proud of that book. If you're really interested in this, that would be a good place to look.
Yeah, definitely. I will at some point in the future, at least. I'm up to my knees in various things I've got to read at the minute, but it's definitely an area of interest. And thank you for kind of giving us a brief outline there. I'll end the stream. Thanks everyone for listening.